introduce yourselves. So please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat and where you're joining us from. And we'll be recording the session today so that this can be used as a resource for campaigners and for city officials to ban fossil fuels advertising in their cities. And this will be available on fossilfueltreaty.org/cities. We have live interpretation to Spanish today. Thank you, Pamela, throughout this whole session. So if you would like to use this function, you can click on the button interpretation at the bottom of the screen and on the language Spanish. And if there's questions in Spanish, you can also click on English for interpretation as well, because it will go both ways. My name is Sedla. I'm the Global Cities campaign lead for the Fossil Fuel Treaty, and I'm going to be facilitating the session with all of you today. And we're joined with incredible activists who are catalyzing campaigns to end fossil fuel advertising in their cities and across Europe. And we hope this inspires you and gives you the tools to do the same where you live. So we know for decades that fossil fuel companies have been denying the climate crisis despite warnings from their own scientists of the harm caused by fossil fuels. And today these tactics are changing to discourses of delay, downplaying the severity of the climate crisis and overstating the progress that they're making towards addressing climate change. And now fossil fuel companies are pumping hundreds of millions of dollars into advertising and sponsorship in a last-ditch attempt to stay afloat. And these greenwashing and manipulation tactics cannot have a platform in our cities. They're harmful and misleading in an attempt to resuscitate the social license of the fossil fuel industry. So today, we're going to dive into the dangerous role of fossil fuel ads in driving the climate crisis, and you're going to hear from grassroots campaigns in Amsterdam and across Europe to ban fossil fuel advertising by law. I'm going to introduce you now to our panelists, and then we'll get started. And once you've heard from our brilliant speakers, we'll open it up to questions before we close. And as a reminder, you can post your questions in the chat throughout the session, and we'll do our best to get to them all. So I want to thank all of our speakers for being here. This wouldn't have been possible without you, and we're super inspired by the campaigning you've been doing. We have Andrew Sims, who is an author, analyst, and campaigner. Andrew co-founded the New Weather Institute and is coordinator of the Rapid Transition Alliance. He is a research associate at the Center for Global Political Economy at the University of Sussex and a fellow of the New Economics Foundation. He's also the Assistant Director of Scientists for Global Responsibility. He co-founded the Green New Deal group and co-authored and published the original Green New Deal and devised Earth Overshoot Day. We have Roseanne, who is a campaigner at the Dutch campaign group Reclame Fossil Free. I'm sorry, I don't speak Dutch, but it means fossil-free advertising, and the Social Tipping Point Coalition. Before becoming a campaigner, she worked in the judiciary in communication and legal work. Fossil-free advertising is a Dutch campaign group which, inspired by the tobacco law, started the world's first campaign aimed at a national law that bans all advertisements and sponsorship of the fossil fuel industry and for air travel and cars on fossil fuels. And last, we have Georgia Whitaker, who has been working at Greenpeace since April 2019 on climate in the EU, Greenpeace's Global Oceans Campaign, and Greenpeace's UK Forest Campaign. For the last 2 years, she's been the lead campaigner for the Fossil-Free Revolution, which is calling for a legal ban on fossil advertising and sponsorship in the EU. And previously to this, she has worked at the Green Party of England and Wales, and for various migrants' rights charities such as Migrants' Rights Network. So I want to thank all of you for being with us today. And so I'll hand it over to Andrew to get started. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Seble, and it's really, really nice to be here, partly because this is linking two of my favorite campaigns. Our version of this campaign is called Babbertising, but the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty campaign and Babbertising actually have common links, the same sort of campaign DNA, in that the treaty was actually first proposed back in 2018, just as we were launching the Rapid Transition Alliance, which gave birth to the Babbertising campaign. And it was just floated initially in an article written by my colleague, Professor Peter Newell at the University of Sussex, and I, and to have seen it grown into this incredible campaign in the last couple of years is really is it's very reassuring for me. But there are other links as well, because both of these campaigns set out to reframe how we think about a problem. Both of them, in a sense, set out to kind of shift our imaginative landscapes. The Fossil Treaty campaign, it's a concrete proposal for a new international mechanism to leave unburnable carbon in the ground. But even by discussing the possibility, we begin to kind of shift our expectations about the future, because in our imaginations, the mere proposal questions and rejects the viability of further fossil fuel exploration and production. To stop adverts fueling the climate emergency, we need to remove those which promote and normalize the fossil fuel industries, but also the high carbon products, services and lifestyles which drive demand for fossil fuels. And the thing which connects this is that as consumers and decision makers, we choose on a day-to-day basis between available options. And one of the things about adverts is that they increase the mental availability of certain options. By ending fossil ads, it's a way of reducing the availability of climate harming options. Also, importantly, from a campaign perspective, both the Fossil Treaty campaign and the campaign to end high carbon advertising are built on proven precedents. The Fossil Treaty itself grew out of the lessons which we took from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And indeed, some of the architecture of that early treaty carries over to the Fossil Treaty around principles like non-proliferation, disarmament, although in this case it's around technology and technology substitution, and around the peaceful use of technologies. And you can find out more about that in the background documents about the campaign. And the other great link at the moment, of course, is the way in which cities around the world are both endorsing the Fossil Treaty and increasingly are beginning to move to pass policies that will end high carbon advertising. Now, advertising on the campaign to end fossil ads draws on the successful precedent of the campaign to end tobacco advertising. And there we can see the parallels and anticipate some of the challenges that we're going to face because of the challenges and the pushback that came from industry over that time. And in fact, some of the playbook that the fossil fuel industry is used today is lifted straight from some of the things that the tobacco industry themselves used. So like the tobacco industry, oil companies knew more about the damage that their products caused than they publicly admitted. And that was revealed in a report on a review of environmental protection activities for 1978, 1979. That was produced for Imperial Oil, Exxon's Canadian subsidiary, in 1980, more than a decade before the UN framework on climate change was signed into existence. You know, it spelt out the level of understanding and awareness within the industry, which is extraordinary. Now, like the tobacco industry, oil companies acted to confuse the science, lobbied to prevent regulation, sometimes denied outright that there was a problem. We saw that in the example of the Imperial Oil chairman, CEO Robert Peterson, writing about a cleaner Canada in 1998, who tried to pass off carbon dioxide as being essential for life on Earth and not at all a pollutant. Now, of course, greenhouse gas emissions and other pollutants from fossil fuels don't just magically enter the atmosphere. They do so when oil and its derivatives are used in other products like transport. And transport is now one of the United Kingdom's largest sectoral sources of carbon emissions, accounts for a full third of our total carbon dioxide output. But sometimes it's hard to tell, because these other industries, like the car industries, like tobacco and the oil industries, have concealed the impacts of their products, sometimes by providing misleading figures for the fuel efficiency of their vehicles, and sometimes by outright cheating, as we saw in the case of the cheat emission devices fixed by Volkswagen. But of course, one of the other things which obscures the problem is advertising itself. And that's the reason that we launched the Badvertising campaign, which you can find out more about at badvertising.org. And we chose as our initial focus as a way that people could relate to the industry, because sometimes fossil fuel companies, for people who are not already active campaigners in this space, can seem very remote. So we wanted to talk about the point at which we really encounter this problem as citizens, as people. So we chose to focus on cars and specifically on SUVs, because as the IEA pointed out, out, SUVs are now the second biggest push factor in rising carbon dioxide emissions. And what has changed to make that a problem? Well, within the space of a decade, sales of cars which are SUVs went from about 1 in 10 of new vehicles to 4 in 10 new vehicles. And that didn't just happen. That happened because they were being actively promoted and pushed by the industry. So we've been campaigning to see, and then specifically initially on SUV advertising, and then now broadening it to look at aviation and other areas. Now, what do? Practically, what we've been doing, and you can dip into the website to have a look at this, to zero in on particularly egregious examples of advertising. We do our badverts of the month, and you can see examples from fossil fuel companies, from aviation, and from car makers. We're looking at how at the local level, new policies can be passed. We've got an action pack, a guide for action at the local level, which you can download from the website, encouraging cities to do it. And then even just in the UK, we've seen cities like Liverpool and Norwich and North Somerset acting on that. We've been pushing at the national level to shift regulations for advertising with the tobacco precedent. We've been pushing the UK government on that. Now, obviously, we're delighted to have been part of the process of the ECI campaign that Georgia will talk more about later. And to illustrate the issue, very recently, I think she might say a little bit more about this as well. We published just over a week ago a report looking at what proportion of emissions from the sectors, from the car sector and the aviation sector, we can attribute to advertising. How much has advertising increased demand for these high carbon activities? We also look at other areas which we think potentially have a huge breakthrough area for us, because in terms of sponsorship and promotion, the world of sport, which culturally speaking is a sort of a major mainstream activity, is dripping with high carbon sponsorship and advertising. And we know the impact that we can have when things change there. There was a famous press conference in which Ronaldo, the footballer, moved a bottle of Coke off a press conference table and wiped millions off the share value of Coke. So these are productive campaigning areas that we can look into. The message, I think, that I want to take from this is that this campaign, this idea, has arrived on the scene quite quickly, is developing very quickly. We've been really encouraged by the speed with which local authorities and cities are looking to align their policies so that if they've declared, for example, a climate emergency declaration, they will have a policy on advertising which is coherent and compliant and supportive of that. We think it's a little bit of a no-brainer. I think the big message from this is that it's a campaign that can and will be won. I'm just going to finish off with a very short little video which we made as part of the campaign, which sums up a number of these issues. I really hope the technology will work. You never know with this. And let's see how this goes.
This is a public information warning from the Ministry for the Climate Emergency. We want to warn you about a poorly understood problem. You've heard of water pollution, you've heard of air pollution, and noise pollution. But have you heard about the dangers of brain pollution? We're exposed to thousands of sources of brain pollution every day. They're almost wherever you look. This pollution, in the form of advertising, passes through your body's defences and becomes lodged in the brain, where it rewires you, forming physical structures. Repeated exposure causes permanent change to the brain, affecting behaviour and how you see the world. Symptoms can include buying things you do not need, wanting things that will not make you happy, feelings of inadequacy, a prevailing sense that excessive consumption and waste are a normal part of life. But some advertising infections are even more toxic and sinister. It's like how in the Amazon, ants can become infected by spores from the parasitic cordyceps fungus, which takes control of their minds, directing them to behave in ways that benefit the fungus, but endanger the ant. We have to tell you, this never ends well. Adverts for fossil fuels and for high carbon goods and services like flights and SUVs act in much the same way as the cordyceps fungus. The climate emergency is putting all of us in terrible danger. Yet we're constantly exposed to adverts telling us to keep buying things that make the problem worse. Thankfully, it's not too late to act. Here's what you can do to protect you, your family, and friends against brain pollution. Support campaigns to stop adverts fueling the climate emergency. Call on your council to end adverts for high carbon polluting products.
And that, as they say, is a wrap. I'll hand back over to Sibley.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for your presentation and the video. We heard you very well. And I want to pass now to Roseanne, who's going to share examples from cities' campaigns in the Netherlands.
Can you all see my screen? I hope so.
Yes, we can see it.
Yes, so I'm going to tell something today about what we did in Amsterdam with Reclame Fossielvrij, how we started our campaign, how we succeeded in Amsterdam and in other Dutch cities, and the lessons we learned along the way, and also about how a fossil air ban is a social tipping point intervention. So actually Shell inspired our campaign because they had a festival in The Hague, the Generation Discover Festival for very small children each year. And it was part of their Make the Future campaign. And at the festival, there was misleading information about how long the energy mix would need oil and gas, and how their gas to liquid diesel would actually contribute to cleaner air. It was also used for lobbying to local and national politicians. Even our prime minister was there, and it received a €100,000 grant each year by the city of The Hague. So the groups The Hague Fossil Free and Fossil Free Education eventually managed to chase away the festival, but they realized it was impossible to act on every separate advertising or marketing event. So they thought we need to find another solution, and that solution was a national ban. So we launched our campaign in March of 2020, and it is a citizens' initiative for a national ad ban for fossil fuel industry, for air travel, and for cars with a fossil fuel engine. And we believe the ban should include all advertisements, including the so-called green ads, all sponsoring for sports, cultural institution, events, marketing festivals, and also lesson materials in schools and universities, which the fossil fuel industry likes to make. But then we thought, okay, we have a pretty right-winged government in the Netherlands, so we need frontrunners. And we want to find them in the media, in cultural institutions, and events and festivals who will all shy away from fossil sponsorships or fossil ads, and of course cities. Because cities have a history of taking on more progressive policies than countries. And we aimed for Amsterdam. It's not only our capital, but it also has a very green coalition. And the alderman had said that she wanted to apply the donut economy of Kate Raworth in the city. And the city council also had adopted a motion to declare a state of climate emergency. So it was a very nice target. And we sent a letter to the city with 51 organizations in Amsterdam, a broad alliance of not only climate groups, but also cultural institutions and education institutes. And we asked the city to align its ads to its climate policy. And we entered into talks with the aldermen, and eventually in December 2020, a motion was passed that said they wanted to forbid ads for flying, for fossil fuel cars with a fossil fuel engine, and ads and festivals by the fossil fuel industry, and that they wanted to investigate how to do this. And then in May 2021, the first ban got into effect in the subway, and it was not an actual ban. It was an agreement between an ad operator and the alderman, that they would ban certain ads, and that was for cheap flights, for ads for cars with a fossil fuel engine, and for oil products. And even though this was not the result that we initially aimed for, and that we are still fighting for, we were very happy. And the motion, and especially the first step in the subway stations, led to a lot of media attention, as you can see here. Not only all the national media wrote about it, but also some international media like BBC World, Sydney Morning Herald. And we saw that it created a domino effect, and that a lot of people worldwide also asked their cities to adopt such a ban. And we also noticed this in the Netherlands, that a lot of the cities, once Amsterdam took on this motion, that a lot of the cities wanted to follow. So in green, you see all the cities that followed, in yellow or orange, the ones that are in the making, and in the red, the ones that haven't succeeded yet. But we have elections in a few weeks, local elections, and a lot of these cities will try again after the elections to get the fossil ad ban. And we're very happy to see, of course, that this is expanding so fast. Well, because this was all very new, we had some lessons to learn that we would like to share with you. We noticed that when proposing or lobbying for a motion, a lot of the times we come into contact with the left-wing parties or the very green parties, but you also have to focus on the middle parties, because they can be crucial for the decisive vote. In the Netherlands, that is, for instance, D66. They are very climate aware, but also very liberal and pro-market and pro-companies. So what you see is that sometimes they vote for it and sometimes they vote against it. So you really have to talk with them before you put it into vote. And sometimes you have to change the motion to get the majority, but that can also take the core of the motion away. So you have to always think about it if you want to do that. What we noticed is that a lot of the Dutch motions or their eventual fulfillments failed to name the fossil fuel industry as one of the ads that should be taken away. So it was only for flights or for cars. And yeah, for us, the fossil fuel industry is very important, especially the greenwashing ads that we see nowadays from Shell. One 13-second commercial, a radio commercial, was found to be misleading in 3 different ways by our advertising code committee, but only after it was shown and heard on the radio all the time. And then for new contracts, it is important to change the city policy before you enter new contracts with advertising operators, and also put this into the new tenders. And one big problem that we had in the Netherlands is that contracts are very long running, sometimes up to 2028. And so most city boards, they choose to talk with these advertising operators, and we have noticed this doesn't work. So in Amsterdam, it worked with one advertising operator, a smaller one, but JC Deco, they, in the Netherlands, they say, well, we cannot do it because we're an international company and we cannot make different rules just for the Netherlands. And because they operate worldwide and are one of the biggest ones, this is a huge problem. We also noticed that some aldermen and parties in council argued that cities cannot act on this because they are afraid it's an infringement on the freedom of speech and only the national government can say something about this. And it's actually not true. They can act on it to protect the health of their citizens. And this is also stated in Article 10, paragraph 2 of the European Convention for Human Rights as an exception. Of course, all these things that I just mentioned, they would be taken away if there was a national or a European law. And the European law, Georgia will tell more on later about. But that's also why we ask aldermen and city council members to put pressure on national parties and on our government. And the aldermen of Amsterdam also did this. What we also learned is always to emphasize that a fossil ad ban is a social tipping point intervention. The Potsdam Institute has a report on this, and they mention a lot of social tipping point interventions, but the fossil ad ban is one of them. And they say these interventions are the best chance to keep below 1.5 degrees. And it's a little bit difficult to explain in such a short time, but what these interventions do, they shift norms and values, they make sustainable choices easier, diminish lobby power for the fossil fuel industry, enhance societal support for really fierce climate policy, and they cause structural emission reductions. So we always like to mention it because sometimes people say it's only symbolic, but it's way more than that because it also takes away the mouthpiece of the fossil fuel industry. And then finally, I just want to tell everybody to just go for it. We have noticed that cities are really front runners on climate policies and also on these fossil fuel ad bans, not only in the Netherlands, but also in the UK and in Scandinavia and in Canada. You see that cities and the council members really take the lead. So if you're a politician or a civil servant, just take this first step. And if you're part of a campaign group or just a concerned citizen, you can first form an alliance and then approach your local politicians. And what is also really important, make your wins known as broadly as possible through press releases, social media, and contacts with your allies, nationally and internationally. And if you need advice on the efforts in your city, feel free to contact us, me at Reclame Fossielvrij, and we will definitely try to help you. We also have a Dutch toolkit made with Greenpeace for cities, and we will make an English translation of this. So you can also contact us for it, and it will eventually appear on our website. And we also have a worldwide page on our website, and there you can see which campaign groups and which cities are already working on a ban. So you can use that for inspiration. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Rosanne. That was incredibly inspiring and really helpful to hear kind of the ins and outs of how you made this possible across cities in the Netherlands. So thank you. Now we're going to scale up geographically to the European level. So Georgia from Greenpeace is going to present. I'm just going to share the screen really quickly, and then we'll get started.
Brilliant. Just before you share your screen, I'm Georgia. It's really nice to meet you. I work on Fossil Free Revolution campaign, which is one of Greenpeace's European-wide campaigns for climate. So yeah, basically we can go already to the next slide actually. In Greenpeace, we saw some of these really fantastic movements at a local level. We saw organisations such as The Guardian stopping taking fossil ad money, and we felt this this increasing movement really building into something quite powerful that we decided that we really wanted to campaign on. If we cast our minds back to when we were really strongly considering this, we knew that there were various national motions as well as greenwashing campaigns coming up, which I'll explain later. And of course, COP coming up in November, which tends to be a real kind of peak point for greenwashing. So one of the inspirations for us really trying to take aim at this on an international level is, of course, as Andrew mentioned earlier, because there is a precedent with the tobacco industry that we can really strongly rely on. So we know that less than 20 years ago in the EU, we legislated a directive that banned tobacco advertising and sponsorships across borders. And so our real visionary aim was to try and start a campaign that would essentially push for a European directive that banned fossil advertising and sponsorships. So that I can go into the details in a bit more detail in a second, but that really is a way of, as has been mentioned, of creating an overarching structural change. And we, alongside 30 plus organisations, including many of our allies here, have really decided to push for that as a means of really tackling not just the issue of high carbon advertising, but the issue of particularly fossil fuel industry greenwashing as well. So next slide, please. So what do we mean by the advertising and sponsorship ban, and what is a European Citizens Initiative, just in case you don't know? So firstly, a European Citizens Initiative is a means, a mechanism wherein which with 1 million signatures, we can place our demands for the European Commission to consider, which they have to legally do. And with that, we have written a draft directive amongst other, sharing other relevant treaty articles to make our case for that. So to describe exactly what our case is and what that directive means, we've used the tobacco directive to basically create a very similar idea for a law based on banning fossil fuel and car and airline companies from advertising and sponsorship. So what would that mean? It's very similar to what's already been described, but to give you an idea, that would mean, for example, Gazprom wouldn't be able to, or Volkswagen wouldn't be able to sponsor the Euros. That would mean education-wise, universities, schools, etc., would not be able to be sponsored. And of course, we wouldn't get countless advertisements for example, cheap airline adverts on our social media feeds or on television, etc. But here's a full technical description of what that ban looks like. Next slide, please. So we launched this European Citizens Initiative, like I said, with 30+ organisations in October last year. And it went incredibly well, I have to say. This was a really brilliant moment, which basically got an amazing amount of press coverage for Greenpeace. We saw transatlantic coverage with the Washington Post, Le Monde, El País, Der Spiegel, and of course from Reuters, calling our campaign one of the boldest ever by environmentalists yet. And I think this really captured the fact that we had kind of caught the zeitgeist of the moment by really building this campaign up to stretch into a European level. With that report, that launch, we launched a report that basically took a quantitative look at the differences between the words and the actions of the fossil fuel industry specifically. So we looked at 6 different companies, including Shell and Total, and looked at percentage-wise, what percentage of their adverts were greenwashers versus what percentage of their capital investments were still in oil and gas. And surprise, surprise, for example, Shell had 80% of their investments in oil and gas. Meanwhile, 81% of their advertisements that we assessed were greenwashers. So yeah, we got some really, really fantastic responses from politicians, etc., including the French Green presidential candidate, who said that an EU ban was unstoppable. And we also received some absolutely furious responses from the likes of Total, Shell, Eni, etc., who said they didn't recognise greenwashing as a label. And also Fortum, one of our favourites, said that their advertisements were essential to make sure the public knew about climate disaster. Which was a lot of fun to respond to in the press, I can assure you. So next slide, please. I should say, actually, you know, in terms of these responses, the fact that we got so many furious responses so quickly shows that this really did hit the fossil fuel industry where it hurt, and therefore is definitely worth pursuing. In terms of rebrands and false promises in the EU, we saw Total become Total Energies last year. We know very recently that Eni have now created a sub-company called Plenitude, and that generally speaking, a lot of top corporations in investigations very recently have essentially been found to have net zero plans, etc., that fall short, and that their words and their actions have huge disparities, showing that the advertisements and sponsorships really do act as a smokescreen to hide from their dirty business. So that's why we're really trying to go for them in Europe. Next slide. I just wanted to share a few of the legal and other ways of challenging fossil ads that we've thought about. So we've already mentioned, I think today, Advertising Standards Agency complaints. We've had offices complaining on a national level and winning in some cases some really, really great gains. And then, of course, on a European and legal level, I won't say too much now, but there are ways of challenging companies for misleading consumers according to the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive in the EU, which is obviously applicable to all EU countries. So yeah, that's just something to consider if you do see any misleading advertising campaigns. Next slide, please. Obviously, there are many other ways of intervening in challenging greenwashing. But as was touched on earlier, those are all very valuable and they build up a snowball effect. But ultimately, we really do need an EU legal ban, much like the directive banning tobacco and sponsorships and advertisements. Next slide, please. Thank you. So in terms of some of the national conversations happening around this, whilst it fell short by a long way, the French climate law was the first national ban on fossil advertisements, but I have to say it was deeply, deeply disappointing. Firstly, because it failed to tackle the issue of greenwashing. It was a ban on fossil products, so you can't advertise, for example, oil or coal, but that doesn't tackle the issue that I mentioned earlier of particularly fossil fuel companies greenwashing. And on top of that, a further development has been, of course, that they have now extended the advertisement of fossil gas, which of course is a fossil product. So that's disappointing. However, it is significant as France is obviously a major national player in the EU. in the Netherlands around the elections in 2021. There were multiple political parties adopting the fossil ad ban in their election programme, thanks to Reclaim Fossil Frag, of course. And very recently, last month in Spain, Congress were debating a proposal around banning the advertisement of combustion car ads. So that's fairly interesting. We also have movement in Belgium, and actually like within the next week, over in the US, we are looking forward to hearing the oil industry CEOs of companies such as Shell, BP, Chevron and Exxon testifying to Congress around their issue in climate disinformation. So there's a real transatlantic element to some of this structural change, which is well worth keeping an eye on. I'm not actually going to go into too much detail here because I think this is already largely being covered, but we are seeing an increasing list of wins or at least motions on the table across the EU amongst cities, particularly in Nordic countries and in the Netherlands. I haven't actually been able to fit all of them in here. But the point is, as has been raised earlier, yeah, that cities really are the beginning of structural change and can be a huge inspiration for bigger structural national and international pushes. So that citywide movement is really, really, really important in terms of creating a real snowball effect. In terms of Brussels, what's going on there? So there has been a file that has been repeatedly delayed, but should now be coming up at the end of March. That there is a file called the Substantiation of Green Claims. Whilst this will be tackling the issue of advertising and potentially greenwashing, this is already looking to be seriously lacking in ambition. That is because it seems to be heading down the line of focusing on consumer responsibility for being able to spot a greenwash, as opposed to placing the responsibility on corporations not to greenwash. So it's looking a bit disappointing already, but it's definitely one that we're going to try and influence. We had David Coman, who is a French MEP for the Green Party, proposing a draft proposition to ban fossil ads for products and services. However, that proposal was rejected. So on a Brussels level, there's still a lot more work to do in terms of changing that debate. And as I mentioned, these campaigns can work at multiple levels, and I think all of those levels are really equally important. But this campaign was in part definitely inspired by the city of Amsterdam and that movement. So we really, really do encourage movement on a local level. A lot of our national offices are working on this as it is, as was mentioned. But having these tangible real world examples and making sure we're communicating them very clearly is absolutely crucial to really creating that momentum that we need to see here. So here's a milestone for you. We have until October to get to that 1 million, and then there is a process afterwards wherein which the EU Commission has to decide about how they're going to respond to our initiative. They have to give solid justifications as to why and how they're going to respond, and then of course that has to go through the whole EU legislative process. So it's a long time frame, but I hope that gives you a good perspective of where we're going. In terms of next steps, of course, we've got a really, really brilliant list of NGOs, including some people here, Client Earth, WWF, Friends of the Earth, etc. But we really need as many people on board, NGOs, movement partners, etc., as possible to collectively get to this 1 million. So we need to, it's really, really simple, sign the ECI, share it on our email list, etc. And we also have some offline mobilizations happening with volunteers taking to the streets, collecting signatures, engaging in some subvertising as well. And of course, as I mentioned, we are also really building on that political support for the European Citizens Initiative to make sure that it gets through to the Commission at the end of the petition signatures. And I believe that's it. I mean, I really, really, really hope that has inspired you. A lot of the other campaigners here definitely inspired me. Of course, please sign the ECI and join the campaign. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Georgia, and to all our speakers. It's been really inspiring to hear the momentum that gets built up from cities and how that can span to a whole continental level. I want to open it up to questions now. So I don't know if there's any in the chat already, but feel free to raise your hand or just add your questions to the chat, and and which speaker you want to address them, and we'll get them to them. In the meantime, we had a few questions which we can ask, and I think the first one is to Andrew. So one second. Okay, so I think a lot of you were clarifying kind of this precedent that the tobacco industry has had in informing how we can ban fossil fuel advertising. So the question that I have for Andrew is, since the tobacco industry is often cited as a precedent, the political consensus, though, that enabled cigarette advertising restrictions is not fully present or more absent when it comes to fossil fuels, particularly in countries with a protective stance on freedom of speech. So how do we bridge that gap?
It's a fantastic question, and it speaks to the fine grain of the precedent of tobacco as well, because we have to remember the situation was very, very similar, that the consensus around the need to end tobacco advertising was very hard fought and very hard won over quite a long period of time. The parallels about there being substantial evidence in the public domain to justify the action, and yet the resistance and the pushback from industry are incredibly similar between fossil fuel interests and tobacco interests. And it was, I think, the point around it was that there was a cultural normalization, and there was a kind of a chicken and egg situation where you needed to get rid of the advertising which normalized the tobacco companies and smoking as a behavior in order to kind of shift the consensus, but you couldn't shift the consensus until you had that thing. So it was really hard fought. And I think when you look at the lessons about how the industries had to be repeatedly challenged, about how there had to be mass mobilization, exactly as is happening now with the kind of actions that Greenpeace are helping to mobilize, that when we dig down into that, it's about holding fast to the evidence. I mean, what won ultimately, even though all the dirty tricks were used by the tobacco companies to delay the point, and also it wasn't won overnight, it was won incrementally. And even now today, there's still battles going on over cigarette packaging, for example. So it is one of those things of kind of constant attritional campaigning to establish your case. But the thing which ultimately won was the argument that public health and action in the public interest was more important than the tobacco industry profits. Now, that was on a kind of like an immediate sort of person-to-person kind of smoking contamination of air argument. But here, of course, it's a much bigger thing which is at stake, which is a livable climate. So if anything, we should be in a better position, a stronger position to drive through our case. And I think that that's the positive lesson that we can take from the tobacco example.
Thank you so much, Andrew. It's interesting to hear so much about how much cultural normalization also plays a role in what we consider normal and what we collectively struggle against as well. I've just seen one question pop up in the chat, so I'm just going to throw that in and then we can keep going. The question is from Mark, who says, I'm trying to launch a fossil fuel ad ban here in Ottawa, Canada. I spoke with my city councillor who's supportive, but the concern is lost revenue in a cash-strapped city. Any suggestions for overcoming this? So I think whichever one of you wants to respond to this, go ahead. Roseanne, yeah?
Yeah, we also heard this from some of the council members. Well, if it's a contract that is still is not due, then that can be a problem to break the contract, of course. But when the new contracts are due for the people who put the advertising there, then I think it's a good argument to say that climate change is eventually going to cost way much more for the city than what they will lose on revenue from these ads, because it will be replaced by other ads. And so I think that's one thing that you can definitely say. And yeah, in Amsterdam, they have the same reasoning why they don't want to breach open the contracts. It's also because they say it's going to cost us too much money, but they don't even investigate how much. So I think you can also ask your counselor to investigate how much they would lose, because maybe it's not even that much.
Thank you, Roseanne. I think that's a really good point, that climate change is vastly more expensive than any revenue from fossil fuel advertising. Okay, I will then just ask Georgia the next question. That Greenpeace is a member of the European Citizens Initiative that you were presenting to us. That is calling on the European Commission to propose an EU legislative act to ban these ads. I guess you've showed us how this is going and how other people can support. Do you have, well, if you want to update anything more on that, and maybe inspiration for other parts of the world who would want to get started?
Yeah, sure. So I didn't share the report that Andrew and I wrote really recently, and I think that I mean, there are multiple ways of demonstrating why advertising is so problematic. And one thing that I say me and Andrew, Greenpeace and the New Weather Institute worked on was a report that basically demonstrated the additional greenhouse gases due to advertising, particularly of cars and flights. And I think when you're trying to make that argument on a local, international or national level, that's something really crucial, and hopefully these numbers are something you can fall back on. So we, in our calculations, using the best publicly available data we had, we found that additional greenhouse gases due to advertising for cars and flights around the world, using 2019 numbers, were at a maximum estimate, and there was a range, almost double the amount of Spain's emissions. So that's huge. And in the EU, for the same calculation, but just looking at adverts in the EU alone, at a maximum estimate, the additional greenhouses as a result of advertising cars and flights were roughly the same as, Belgium's in 2019, which is the same year. So I think that really does demonstrate that that these adverts aren't just something that we see on our social media channels or whatever. These have very real and very tangible impacts, and greenwashing is very dangerous, of course, but the promotion of high carbon adverts in of themselves is frankly just bizarre. And I hope that in terms of political conversations and really swaying people is an argument that could really help you, because it's just commonsensical. After the IPCC this week, after COP, after all of the evidence that is emerging, I would hope that at least would be a bit of a no-brainer. So I'll just pop that research into the chat. But yeah, I think that's a really helpful argument that we found in terms of speaking to decision makers.
Thank you, Georgia. Oh, sorry, did you want to add something?
Yeah, just in terms of supporting the ECI, as I mentioned, sharing it, etc., that I can share my slides afterwards.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. I've seen a question from Leah Temper, who said, I'm interested in how to push the fossil fuel treaty together with an ad ban at the municipal level. Do you propose a stepwise approach? I guess I can make some comments to that, and whoever wants to add on to it. I think the main reason that this whole workshop series was created in the first place was because a lot of cities that have already passed fossil fuel treaty endorsements were always asking, what next? What more can we do to kind of phase out fossil fuels from our city and accelerate this just energy transition? And so this action is part of a whole toolkit we have of fossil fuel free cities. And I think it really depends on what is the kind of dynamic of the city council where you live. For example, Amsterdam has both most recently endorsed the fossil fuel treaty, which we're really excited about. And then of course, Roseanne and Femke have been doing all this amazing work to ban fossil fuel advertising in Amsterdam. And these were kind of two separate processes. And also what Roseanne was sharing, you have to kind of see the makeup of your city council and how do they vote, how do they lean, because are you likely to get support if you're adding all these demands at once, or is it more likely that you do one by one and then you have more traction? So I guess if you feel that your council is really ambitious and green and forward thinking, then it's possible to add more demands to your initial kind of resolution. But if you see there's a lot of hesitancy and resistance and you don't have as much support, then it could be better to just do these separately. That would be my initial feedback. I don't know if anyone wants to add anything more to that comment or question.
I'll just say one thing quickly, if I can, and that's to say that within the United Kingdom, especially, and I know it's something which has been rolled out far more internationally as well, but one of the lightning conductor rods for action at the local council level has been around the declaration of climate emergencies, making formal climate emergency declarations. But there's also obviously been quite a lot of work done to show that since the announcement of climate emergency or the passing of motions in support of climate emergency declarations, there's been something of a significant vacuum, an absence of plans that meaningfully set out to deliver on those emergency declarations. And I think one of the points where you have a lot of very logical and common sense leverage is, I mean, in the UK, over 90% of people live in an area where at some level or other of government a climate emergency has been declared, well over 90%. So there's a kind of a democratic mandate for action. I think then you're in a very strong position. And I think it's a tactical question which can be influenced by the characters who are your local councillors or your city councillors, your municipal representatives. But once you have that established, it's not actually a huge ask to say, well, is it, having declared a climate emergency, is it therefore still compatible to allow high carbon advertising? Is it still therefore compatible to not support a line in the sand about further locking in of fossil fuel infrastructure? So support for the treaty and support for policies on fossil ad bans should be wholly consistent with actions and steps that many, many councillors have already taken and are actually looking around for ways to make real, to implement, to operationalize. So I think there's a lot that can be done in arguing those points. Now, whether or not you do that in a two-step process or together, I think depends quite a lot on the particular political nature of and setup of your, whatever your municipal authority is. And that's a judgment call best made probably by local activists.
Thank you so much. And then there's also a comment in the chat that there's a lot to be learned also from campaigns to ban junk food advertising in cities. So I think there's a lot of precedents that we can be learning from. Georgia, sorry, did you want to say something or should I go on to another? Okay. All right, and then the question I wanted to ask is for Roseanne. So last month, there was more than 450 scientists that signed an open letter calling on advertising and PR agencies to stop working with fossil fuel companies as clients. Just wanted to check if you know how quickly this is growing as a movement while others are kind of working to enact legislation.
Yeah, definitely helps that people are working on this on all levels. And so we think this can also add to that social tipping point and also to the tipping point on the ad ban. And of course, when scientists say this, sometimes it has more impact than if activists say it. So yeah, we're very happy that that they do this. And also, for instance, if physicians make themselves heard about how important it is to add these bans, or for PR companies not to work for fossil fuel companies anymore, like they don't do anymore for tobacco companies, yeah, everything helps a lot. Yeah.
Thank you so much. So we only have 5 minutes left. I don't know if the three of you wanted to make any other comments before we close, or I can just, or leave any, I see you've been putting resources in the chat also for everyone that's here. So feel free if you want to say anything, or you don't have to if you wouldn't like, and then I can just wrap it up.
One very quick comment. I see that my friend and colleague Robbie Gillett from Ad Free Cities is in with us as well, and has just posted some of the background on the food campaigning, which is an incredibly useful resource. And again, just to kind of pick on, it feels like the moment is right for this. I think almost with the very mention of the precedent of what happened with tobacco advertising and the higher stakes of the climate emergency. I think in one sense, the argument is won. The campaign is not won. The argument, I think, is almost won in the way that we introduce it. And the way in which local groups are emerging, some in my local neighborhoods and boroughs in London, the Ad Free Cities Network itself, I think there's a tremendous moment right now, and the ecosystem of organizations working on it in a complementary way, looking at legal aspects, looking at challenging greenwashing, looking at delivering these policies. It's just fantastic, and it's really great to have everybody here. And it's brilliant also to be making the links with the kind of the structural, infrastructural proposals like the fossil fuel treaty as well. So fantastic to see everyone and to hear everything. Really encouraging.
Thank you so much, Andrew. We've been really excited to have all of you here. Georgia and Roseanne, would you like to say anything, or should I just wrap it up as you wish? Go ahead.
Yeah, I can't say too much, but just watch this space over the next 48 hours for some very, very interesting developments on our social media channels at Greenpeace. So yeah, please do have a look at that for some more ideas around campaigning.
We love surprises, so we're looking forward to it.
Oh yeah, and I just wanted to thank you, Seble, and the others at the treaty for organizing this event, of course, because we like this to be broader known and wider known, so it's perfect. Yeah.
Well, thank you, all three of you, so much, Andrew, Roseanne, and Georgia. We're so grateful that you were with us today, and I think it's inspiring to see the further actions that cities can take to phase out fossil fuels and remove their social license and make sure that we can just really propel this just transition. And I want to say also a really massive thank you to Gemma for doing all the tech and comp support, and Viviana for doing the live tweeting, and Pamela for the interpretation. There's a lot of different ways that you can get involved in the treaty. You can endorse as your organization or as an individual at fossilfueltreaty.org. I think the links will be put in the chat. If you are interested in launching a campaign for your city to endorse the Fossil Fuel Treaty, you can contact me. It's my first name, Seble, at fossilfueltreaty.org. And then we also have a ton of resources at fossilfueltreaty.org/cities. There's draft resolutions, there's a pitch to cities, a support guide to influencing local governments. We have a fossil fuel-free cities toolkit. So all of this is available. We'll add also this workshop there, and we have a sister city campaign called Safe Cities that you can check out to join the movement at stand.earth/safe. And there's a lot of resources that you'll get from this page too, to pass policies to get fossil fuels out of your community. So I want to thank you all for participating in this session. We're looking forward to staying connected with you. This is just the first of a series, a workshop series on cities for a fossil fuel treaty. So please stay tuned, and thank you, everyone. Bye.